It's my pleasure to introduce Garry Momber, who's going to be speaking about engaging with the public and how we can use some exciting historical artifacts to help with this. This is hopefully full of nice photos for you to all see. Garry is a director of Maritime Archaeology Trust. They are one of the partners on the SARCC project. And I'm sure he's going to do a great job at talking about the engagement side of things and the longue durée. So, Garry, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me and for being part of this project, which has been quite a roller coaster over the last 3 years. I'm going to be talking now about engaging the public, a key for NBS mainstreaming. Now, the session we got here is about 50 minutes long. I'm supposed to have about 20 minutes. It might be a little bit longer. But see it all as one sort of holistic approach. Both of the talks will be combined as one. So don't worry about any overruns. And that's the reason I'm going to need a few more minutes, because I'm going to try and give a bit more context. And we're talking about engaging the public, and we've used a visualization tool in the roadshow, etc. to do that. A lot of that's going to be presented after my talk. So I'm giving a bit of a grounding and to talk about some of the data that we're pulling together that we then use to engage the public. So what we've been doing is we've been looking at the past, looking at the history in the past, or the longue durée. I have to pronounce that correctly because sometimes my British colleagues do wonder what longue durée means. So a review of the longue durée demonstrates how humans and natural influences contribute to the evolution of the coastline. This is something that we've been looking at to really understand how the coastline has been fashioned and moulded. And we can use historical, archaeological, and artistic information to really understand and read the changes in the coastline. Now, we read the changes in the coastline, how they've changed, to understand those long-term patterns of change. And the beauty of this is that it helps stakeholders, coastal managers, and decision makers consider solutions that work with long-term processes. So if we can help inform coastal managers and stakeholders about those patterns of change, it can maybe inform their decision-making process. And something that Mikhail mentioned earlier about the oral history of the mangroves in Nicaragua, going back 60 years to help them understand what these changes have been. We can look back in some places hundreds or thousands of years to see what these patterns of changes are. And the thing is, this hasn't really been done in the past. So to give you a bit of a long-term overview to start, see if this works. We're going back now to the end of the last ice age. Sea levels were, before the last ice age, sea levels were quite high. Then they dropped down to about 120, 130 meters lower than today. And then they rose again. But as they rose, they reshaped the landscape. They eroded cliffs. They created estuaries and remolded them and pushed them further and further back upshore until they created what was the current coastline. And with that current coastline, which was created about 5,000 years ago or so, they had a certain sediment budget, and this has been mentioned already. And that sediment budget is sort of limited. John was saying earlier about the issue of the sand in the North Sea, and we'll look at the Belgium coast and the sand machine that's been made. There's only so much sand in the oceans, and that's been formed. We have to understand where it comes from, how much is left, etc. And then with that, we can start adapting change. And because of that limited budget and because of the way the coastline has been formed, it's been formed in a certain way, and then certain things are going to happen to it in the future. And what we have had in the last few years is a relative equilibrium. And the equilibrium has given us these lumps of sand in the beaches, the big sort of sandbanks and the beaches around the coastline that's been relatively stable. But the sea is dynamic, and it is always moving, so it tends to push things around here and there. And as soon as we start putting grey infrastructure in place and interfering with those natural processes, what we do is we remove the adaptability of the coastline, the natural adaptability of the coastline to change. And I think that's what the evolution of the coastline and the past nature-based solutions that worked, it's good if we can think about replicating them and not keep building grey infrastructure. Now, this area here, which I should, this area here I just went through there, it was the Solent. And the Solent is the north shores of the Isle of Wight. And the Isle of Wight's an island that actually was just formed, was once a sort of valley, and then the Solent was a valley infilled. I should have said this as the slide went through. It infilled, and then a new channel was formed that cut around the top, across the north of the Isle of Wight and south of Great Britain. Now, this is not dissimilar in many ways to the North Sea, where you had a big sort of swamp, you had valleys, you had a low-lying land, you had continental Europe on one side, and you had Great Britain on the other, and then you had a new channel formed. And so this Solent is a bit of an analogue to the North Sea, and as such, we've been using it over a few years to try and monitor the changes with the formation of this new channel. And the new channel, what you can see is, on the top here, you can see obviously the Isle of Wight, the coast of the Isle of Wight, and then in the middle, you can see the submerged landscape. This was all the infilled sediments before the channel was formed, like before the North Sea was formed. It was the remains of the underlying landscape that is now eroding away. In many ways, just as the sea level is eroding, the subtidal sites are eroding away around the North Sea. But you can't see this. But the trouble is when you can't see it, you don't do much about it. And because it's eroding away and being lost, what's happening is that the threats to the coastline are increasing, the wave energy is increasing, it's falling apart. Now, so that's happening, but you also have a lot, as you see in the bottom here, you have a lot of archaeological material because that land was once occupied and people lived on it. And you can use that archaeological evidence to try and tell a story. These here are flints, hundreds and hundreds of worked flints that we found at that particular site. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this area, this stretches for over a kilometre east and west. This is an image of an underwater cliff. And what you have here, this sort of area here, this area here is all part of a relic land surface. It's covered in trees, relic trees, about 8,000 years old. And above it, you've got sediments that have been built up and they're protecting it. They were protecting it until recent times. Now they're eroding away, and as they're being lost, so is the archaeological material, but also so is the water increasing, the depth of water and the energy, etc., that's threatening the landmass. So as part of the Interreg project, we've been monitoring some of those changes through time and to see if we can see what impact it's having on the coastline. And you can see at the top here, this was a record from a couple of years ago where you've got a whole bunch of boulders that have fallen down from what is this underwater clay. And then below here is the same area that was just taken from last summer. And there's been quite a change, quite a movement of sediments, and as things are being washed away and eroded, and therefore increasing the threats to the coastline. And it's a natural, wonderful environment to look at. It's full of lobsters and eels that are eating away and digging their little burrows under the seabed. Can you hear me okay? It seems to be coming on and off. Eels and lobsters eating away at the seabed. They're digging out the archaeological material. You can see it in the foreground here. There's nice. That's a lovely bladelet there and a core. Wonderful archaeological material being dug out. I'm afraid the image is a bit fuzzy. I didn't want to get too close. And what we're finding are lots and lots of these flints, and we've been finding hundreds of them over the years, really well preserved because they've just recently been eroded from these sites. And the recent erosion is important because it shows you that the problem is happening now and it wasn't happening before. And this is manifest more so in other parts of that submerged landscape where what we have are organic remains. We have, again, 8,000 years old. We have what was a log boat building site. We have a platform. You can see at the bottom here, about 60, 70 pieces of timber. And then in the middle at the top, you can see the remains of trees coming out of the sandbanks. And all these areas are only very recently being eroded, so they're direct indicators of change. And this has happened for the first time in over 8,000 years, which shows that change is a modern phenomena. And it's invariably due to people manipulating the coastline. And what that can tell you as well, 8,000 years ago, is how humans at the time worked with the landscape, adapted to the landscape, and lived on that landscape. So it creates a human story, and very well preserved. And likewise, just similar to the last slide, just showing you the different areas between the different years where those sites have been eroded and lost. All this work tends to be possible. That's a stretch of about 50 meters. This work tends to be possible because of modern techniques, photogrammetry, etc., that we've been developing through the course of the SARCC project. And this is the sort of material that we should be looking at from all the other sites around sort of northwest Europe, where you have these sort of deltaic environments. But I should just go up to the intertidal zone, which is sometimes easier to see and more tangible. And this is an area of the northwest Solent, sort of opposite the area I just showed you. And what we've been doing here is we've been looking at some charts to see how the coastline has regressed. And this chart on the top left-hand corner is 1991. And see the black circle in the middle there? That relates to the chart on the bottom, which is about 200 years earlier. And that should be about here. So you can see, and on the bottom right-hand corner, it shows mudflats at 3 water high tide, and at the top, you've just got low water tide. So what we've seen is all these mudflats have pretty much gone, they've all receded. But underneath them, we're finding landscapes that are 5,000 years old. That shows us that those mudflats were stable for 5,000 years, and they've been lost, not as a direct result of sea level change, but more to do with human manipulation of the landscape and stopping sediment supply, etc. As I mentioned at the beginning about the sediment supply in the oceans, has been stopped from moving around, and also from the sediments from the land being stopped from going down into the oceans. And if we have a look at that spit, just as an example of some of the information that you can learn from the underwater landscape, is that's that her spit, which was the one just on the left here. That's her spit, which is blocking the mouth of the Solent, or, well, sheltering the mouth of the Solent. If you look at the coloured areas, which is land below water, there's areas of peat which are just recently exposed. Again, it erodes away pretty quickly, so it's only been exposed a number of years. That's exposed on the left here, and what it's shown is the spit itself is slowly migrating upslope. It's going upslope, which actually puts it in much greater risk of being overtopped. And this is something no one's really looking at, but it could help inform how you manage that spit in the future. Because what is happening nowadays, and that's the end of the spit in more recent times, the spit is migrating, and then these structures they built on it with good intention about 120, 130 years ago are starting to fall down now, and they're defending them, but they're not really identifying the root cause of the problem, which is the lack of sediment coming to the spit and moving around. So, yeah, and I'd be careful, I'm not a hydrographer. But the root cause of the problem, and identifying, looking under the water to see what's actually happening beyond the obvious. And so they keep protecting it, but in the end of the day, unless they can somehow provide more sediment, it's all going to be lost. So, not the best. But other areas just on the northwest Solent, areas that are, say, sometimes a bit more obvious to the person walking down the beach, are these areas of mudflats. That area of mudflats I showed you earlier in the chart, this is what it looks like now. Well, the mudflat's gone, the coastline's being protected, and you're down to the underlying geology. And within it, you've got all this archaeology again. Here are some Roman posts, which dated to 255 to 418 AD. These Roman posts have recently been exposed. Then within a matter of year, there's hardly anything left. Demonstrates, it shows you direct evidence of a bit of coastline, a bit of beach that's recently been exposed, probably for the first time, and is now going, and it's under direct threat. And the archaeology has given you that indication. Not only that, when we look at the archaeology, we can look at some of the older material a bit further down the beach. And this here is Bronze Age, 3,500 years old, structure recently exposed, now eroding away. But it can start give you an idea of sort of the rate and pace of, well, the rate and scale of the sea level rise in the past, when you can actually date points in the intertidal zone where these structures were made. It gives you the sort of rate of change of sea level rise, also the fact at that point they were covered by sediments and protected. And then now it can actually show you that all these sites are now demonstrably under threat and need attention. And so that can then help the decision makers decide what to do to protect the sites the best they can. And this is just another site, a shot a year later, showing how this is eroding away, just to show these sites are quite ethereal, they go quite quickly. So they're indicators of past change, indicators of current change, and they can be used for that purpose, not just for their cultural value, which of course is also very important. And so this is another area along the whole stretch of beach here in the northwest Solent that we've been running drone surveys and monitoring the variation in the sediment load and the beach profiles on the northwest Solent to try and identify what the long-term processes are. On the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the remains of a Neolithic forest that's over 5,000 years old. Same issues apply as I've already discussed. So that's a wonderful case study, and that's an area that's sort of central to the SARCC SARCC region, SARCC project region, but it's an area, not a pilot area. So I'm just going to run through some of the pilot sites now to show you the sorts of data that we've been collecting from the different areas and the types of data sets we can use to try and understand the past formation processes around these particular sites, and then maybe the consequences or patterns of attack that are underway at the moment. So we'll start with Newlyn in the far west. And we can see here on the right, we got submerged forest. The same sort of issues apply. Submerged forest recently been exposed in the intertidal zone, showing that following these storms, there's certain threats. There's been a bit of a change in the dynamic. And we could say, is the dynamic climate change, or is there more to it? On the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the old harbour, which is circled on here. And that was a nice, neat little harbour. But going back to this chart, before the development of the North Pier, about 150 years ago, you can see where the harbour is. We've got a nice big beach profile. It's snuggled in the back. You've got nice pretty ships nearby to tell the story of it, not having a big impact on the landscape. As soon as the North Pier is put in place, in the middle image, you can see the beach starts to strip back. Obviously, mud accrues within the harbour, and the beach size starts to be reduced. And with the reduced beach size, we get all those problems. Reduced beach side, the water energy increases and the threats to the coastline increase. And we see that today. And what actually happens, this nice Environment Agency slide, what you can see here is the water just runs up the sides of the North Pier, channeled up into the Tolkien little village there, and then you get constant problems every year. So constant problems whenever there's a storm. So the lesson is maybe you should have thought about it first before you stuck in the North Pier. We've already heard about some of the nature-based solutions being applied to try and rectify that matter. Just jumping to Southend-on-Sea, we've looked at some nice old charts to see how the River Thames has changed, the dynamic of the River Thames has changed, and how there's been a lot of infilling, and there's been a lot of poldering and diking of the Thames, which has increased the height of the waterways, and therefore increased threats along the river. And what we've been doing is, with the data, with these ancient charts, and with ancient charts, ancient photographs of the like we just saw in Newlyn, is we incorporate and put them into the visualization tool, which this is an image from the visualization tool that Jasmine will be talking about in more detail later, so I won't go into that. But we put it all there, and once we put it into this tool, we can use it, look at it comparatively, and we can start to understand what it can tell us about erosion and change along the coastline. The sorts of images we use are artistic images as well as maps and charts. Artistic images can tell you how the coastline has changed, but interestingly, and we were mentioning things like finance earlier, when it comes to elements of insurance and the like, here we can see, going back to 1870, there were problems with landslips along the coastline here, and that's sort of an area that you don't really want to build your house or your hotel, although people did. But if they took that into account, first of all, they wouldn't build there, whereas the other areas are very stable, and we found sites along the coastline would be very stable, demonstrated by sort of Iron Age monuments that haven't moved, and there you know, well, the insurance risk is much less. So you can use this historical evidence to try and understand threats to the coastline going back into the quite deep past. And then we use nice images, places like Leigh-on-Sea, that you can see how it's changed through time. And one thing that's quite clear between 1852 and then development 1855 and 1900 is the fact that that beach has turned into a pretty hard structure. So what you get here is, once you get the hard structure, of course, you lose the defense of the beach, the mechanism, the adaptability of the coastline to change and shift, and then you start to get underpinning and scour around hard structures. This is a similar thing that happened to in Gravelines, where they had a nice channel going to the right-hand side, the River A, but that tended to get silted up, and got silted up because of longshore drift and a lot of sand. So they decided to put a big canal out a few hundred years ago, been doing it for about almost 1,000 years. And that canal was fine, but in time, the natural processes started to dominate. And what you find is you had a build-up, longshore drift, build-up of dunes on the west here, and in the east, more sort of scour out. And now that's become a nice focal point for waves to come straight in, straight down, be channeled down the side of the canal there, and then going direct threat onto the beach. What's more, of course, they decided to build on all the dune systems, stop them being adaptable, and building all the houses along there, all with the best intentions, but if only they'd thought about it beforehand. And these are lessons that can be carried forward. Right, going back to Belgium, I'll sum up quite quickly. I'll put all three, sorry, Belgium, but Middelkerke, Ostende, and Blankenberg can pile them all in together because it's a similar sort of coastline. And the threats to the coastline were really going back to sort of the Roman period, where a lot of the landscape, and the same with the Netherlands, was excavated, dug up, manipulated, diked, putting up these banks and that sort of increasing water height. So it was a large manipulation of the landscape that's actually induced a lot of the threats and the problems through time. I mean, just going back about 350 years, you can see massive dune systems just going to the west of Ostend, great big dune systems that formed quite a natural defence. They're quite adaptive because you had the links between the dune systems and you had the sea, and they were adaptable and they defend themselves until, of course, people started digging big holes and undermining the landscape behind. And there's evidence of this excavation of the landscape with these peat deposits, all with sort of holes. You see in the foreground here, these are seen on the beach in Raverside following storms, and those peats were also dug up in the Roman period. And so in the Roman period, of course, this was land, so the landscape was much further out. In fact, around just before the Roman period, it went out for about quite a few kilometres further out to sea than it does now. So what's happened is human manipulation has actually pushed the land back, and in more recent times, what we've done here, and you can see there's a big road, the coastal road, has actually separated the dunes from the beach, and what you're getting is lots and lots of erosion and loss of the sand, and all that loss of the sand on the beach through time is evidenced in that historical and archaeological record. But now, more recently, of course, we've come back to nature-based solutions, and as we've seen, they're working very well. So what we're seeing is now almost a sand dune system being pushed in front of the road, so it's trying to revert back to where nature was in a certain equilibrium not so long ago. And you can see that in Middelkerke as well. And I'll just finish with Vlissingen, because Vlissingen was quite an interesting case study. It was a place that you shouldn't really have a town, because it's on a sort of nice peninsula. And so what they had to do was build lots of big sea defences to protect themselves from the sea, to control the waterway into Antwerpen. So you have a lot of sea defences. And of course, sea defences are defences because by nature, you're going to have to constantly keep rebuilding them because you're defending yourself from the sea. So they haven't used the natural environment. And as a consequence, they haven't used the natural environment. I'm losing my train of thought. They haven't used the natural environment. They've defended it, but it means they're going to have to keep defending it. But it's not appropriate to use the natural environment because, of course, they needed quays and jetties and things for human activities. And whenever they build all these defences around the Netherlands in particular, and, of course, whenever there's a breach, the responses can be quite devastating. And I said, make that final point that the sea defences are going to be defended, and they're constantly defended ad infinitum until you can return to nature-based solutions. So, just finishing off with a few points about some of the outreach, which we will be talking more about in a minute in the next couple of talks. I should say we have used various methods of outreach, academic publications. There have been several publications. I'm sure this will be talked more about by David in relation to WP6, and the guidance booklets, WP1 and WP2. So there's been sort of high-level publications being produced from it. There's been education programs developed. This one here, Climate Change and Flooding Assembly, it's been developed by Better Plans, just through Southend-on-Sea, put this forward. This is really just highlighting for fairly straightforward examples of flooding in places like York and other cities around the coastline and what the immediate threats are. And then through the Trust, we've looked further back in time and we've tried to link to the visualization tool, and we tried to demonstrate the lessons that can be learned from the past with an education pack that can look at look into the history and try and draw examples from the past. And so this is just sort of flipping through examples of them. These will be accessible through the visualization tool as it's developed. And then the roadshow, of course, the Discovery bus went around all the different pilot areas and the south coast of England, and we reached almost 500,000 people who had a wonderful time exploring all the activities on and around the Discovery bus. So, but we'll talk about that later, as we will be doing with the visualization tool, which has been produced, which Jasmine will talk about, so I don't need to finish there. And just coming to my final slides, talks and presentations, of which we've been given quite a few. And sort of some of the last couple of talks that we've been given are actually working with UNESCO and sort of the UN Oceans conference in Lisbon, which has been supported by the SARCC project. And this has enabled us to talk about SARCC as something sustainable and where we can use cultural heritage to help understand these long-term patterns of the coastline. And it's starting to be taken more seriously, and we're going to continue to sort of promote it through the UN Decade of Ocean Science, and how we can best understand the oceans using sort of anthropological evidence. And to finish, I'll sum up by just stating the SARCC project has used a range of methods to engage the public and stakeholders with a narrative that harnesses artistic, historical, and archaeological data to convey the longue durée, gain wisdom from hindsight, and advocate a way forward with nature-based solutions. So we're looking to green the grey. So thank you.